Hey everybody. Last week I ended with a few thoughts about some intellectual developments in late Victorian Europe. I'm going to begin today's lecture by picking up that story for just a few minutes, and then we're going to pivot and discuss the origins of World War I as well as the experiences on the battlefields of World War I. You'll remember last week we looked at Nietzsche and his rejection of Enlightenment principles, Christianity, and Victorian norms in favor of the will to power. Another critical theorist of the irrational, of this embrace of irrationality, let me just turn up my volume a little bit for you, was Sigmund Freud. Freud was the inventor of psychoanalysis, but in recent decades, many psychologists and psychiatrists have moved away from certain aspects of Freudian theory. Those of you who are psychology majors surely know much more about his place in the field today than I do. Our concern today is less with his influence over contemporary psychology or psychiatry than it is with the historical significance of some of his ideas. Freud's theories represented a very new way of conceptualizing the complexity of the human self, the problem of reason, of rationality and irrationality. The essence of Freudian theory is that people are fundamentally irrational, that human behavior is governed by deep-seated inner forces which operate below our conscious thinking. And to Freud, these forces, which operate in a realm he calls the unconscious, were the passions, the strivings, the motivations that we're unaware of, but that actually govern our choices in really profound, often undetected ways. Freud was not the first theorist to suggest something like this. There had been ideas of the unconscious floating around since antiquity, right, for thousands of years. But he was the first to study it systematically. And he called this method of studying the unconscious psychoanalysis. Okay, let's take a look at the man himself. I think this picture of Freud is like Freud doing an impression of Freud, if that makes sense. Freud's major insight was that psychological disorders and neuroses, things like depression, anxiety, obsession, had psychological causes. Now that probably sounds obvious to all of us, right? But in the 19th century, that was not the normative a way of thinking about psychological disorder. Instead, usually theorists would attribute psychological disorder to something physical, okay? But psychological traumas, Freud suggested, especially those linked to childhood, were essential for understanding one's psyche. He hypothesized that his patients repressed their painful childhood memories to the point that they entered the realm of the unconscious, and from there they would bubble up and manifest as psychological disturbance. And he developed various methods for understanding the unconscious, for accessing it, right? For trying to figure out what's actually in there. Free association, for example, involved the patient simply saying whatever came to mind. And Freud thought this would reveal sort of secret preoccupations at the heart of someone's distress. Another method was dream analysis. For Freud, dreams were full of meaning, and analyzing them was kind of essential for self-knowledge. Both free association and dream analysis conflicted with the ideals of Enlightenment theory. I remember Enlightenment thinkers were positing that people are fundamentally rational. People are driven primarily by reason, which is easily identifiable, easily measurable. And that means that people are always capable of subduing greed, violence, lust, as long as they try. Okay. Freud, he's working in turn of the century Vienna, and he's convinced that the unconscious mind is much more powerful, okay, much less easily disciplined than Enlightenment thinkers would have imagined. The conscious and the unconscious exist in a constant conflict And frequently the unconscious is the part of ourselves that wins out. Freud created a model of the human psyche to explain this conflict. The unconscious mind, he called our id. You've probably heard this before, the id and the ego and superego, right? And the id is, as he put it, the dark, inaccessible part of our personality, a cauldron of seething excitations, right? The id is irrationality. It has no moral center, no awareness of good or evil. It simply wants what it wants. It's pure instinct. Gratifying the id is the height of human pleasure, but that means that the id is also sort of antisocial, right? Civilization requires us to subdue, to control the id. The ego, on the other hand, was a force of reason and existed to keep the id in check. And in this struggle, the ego has help from what's called the superego, which is like an internalized authority figure who makes us feel guilt or shame in order to prevent the id from running wild, right? The superego is sort of the moral norms, the codes of ethics that we accept from our society. So there's this intense conflict of id, ego, superego. Freud believed that leaves people in an uncomfortable bind, especially modern people are constantly distressed by this conflict. If they repress their instinctual desires in the name of civilization, they're terribly uncomfortable, right? They have needs that are unmet. But if they don't restrain those desires, then they're going to suffer from guilt from the superego, or more extremely, the entire civilizational order will collapse. In other words, Freud is suggesting that the price we pay for civilization are anxiety and distress. Now, Freud and Nietzsche were not the only prophets of the irrational. You remember as well how Nietzsche would respond to a formulation like Freud's, right? If Freud says the price we pay for civilization is anxiety and distress, Nietzsche would say yes, and that's why we need this sort of overman, this transcendent individual who can move past civilization and all of the things that bind us and achieve the will to power. But they're not the only ones who are doing this kind of work. Their works had ripple effects throughout European culture in the visual arts, right? Such as Edvard Munch's The Scream, Norwegian painter here, right? A painting that seems to evoke the id at its most horrifying, right? A realization that civilization is without order, is truly without order, or is truly restraining us from something essential. In Joseph Conrad's novel, The Heart of Darkness, which was both a devastating critique of imperialism, but also an exploration of the irrational mind set free. Or in the sociological analysis of Gustave Le Bon, we read a little bit of this last week, whose work The Crowd explored how irrational forces could affect social and political behavior. There's also a significant political outcome from this sort of drift towards embracing the irrational. If modern philosophers were correct, right, and artists were correct, and novelists were correct, then humanity's future depended not on reason, but on instinct. Moral values were not timeless, but relative. And free of moral constraint, all tactics, even the bloodiest, right, even the most unthinkable, could suddenly be justified. And in the wake of the First World War, which I'll get to in just a second, politicians are going to increasingly adopt these lessons. They're going to increasingly embrace the irrational, and they're going to increasingly challenge the moral norms of civilization from the late 19th century to construct a new political order, one based on Nietzsche's will to power as opposed to restraint. Okay, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. We need to understand the First World War before we jump to some of its outcomes. World War I lasted from 1914 to 1918. We've just passed the centennial of the First World War, and so over the last 5 or 6 years, we've been seeing a lot of commemorations. It's sort of returning to public consciousness. I think especially here in the US, World War I occupies a sort of awkward and an uncomfortable place in our own history. The United States only entered the war in its very last stages. It's not a very significant part of our historical memory, but it is an absolutely pivotal moment in the history of the modern world. So let's talk about where it comes from. As I mentioned last week, Germany's unification in 1871 created a shift in the balance of power on the European continent. France had been defeated and humiliated in the Franco-Prussian War. Austria was bogged down by nationalist insurgencies, and all eyes are suddenly turning to this swaggering, united, militaristic, very frightening new German power right in the heart of Europe. And it was this guy who was largely responsible for it, Otto von Bismarck, right? He's the German chancellor in the 1870s and the 1880s. And he initially pursues actually a very sort of moderate and cautious foreign policy, right? Bismarck's really concerned with simply maintaining the borders of this new country that he has played a really significant role in uniting. Germany is powerful, it's swaggering, it's intimidating to many other countries, but it is also a very new country. And it's also dependent on binding up regions, German-speaking regions, that have historically been autonomous. So that is by its very nature a somewhat unstable proposition, and something that can be challenging to maintain, especially in its early years as you construct sort of new political traditions and new political norms and relationships. So that's really what he's mostly interested in. His secondary goal goes back to that Franco-Prussian War, and he's realizing the French, well, they want revenge. They're still humiliated, and the French are going to be a significant threat to German safety for years, maybe even decades to come. He wants to keep them isolated. He wants to keep them at bay because he knows he's left quite a scar in the French psyche from that war, that Franco-Prussian War back in 1870 and 1871. One of the reasons for this, aside from just the rapid nature of the military defeat, the fact that the French emperor was captured, but also the Germans had claimed at the end of that war a contested region, the provinces of Alsace-Lorraine, which is in eastern France, right along the border with Germany. It is home to French and German speakers. And the French want revenge. French school children grow up pledging to one day reclaim this lost territory, to one day avenge the humiliation of the Franco-Prussian War. So these are generational resentments. They linger long into the 20th century, and Bismarck recognizes this is going to be a problem for us. So to prevent French revenge and to help maintain his own new borders, Bismarck engineers a so-called Triple Alliance. And this is with Italy and Austria-Hungary. Okay, so a somewhat unstable but still very significant power in Austria-Hungary, and like I said last week, a new power in Italy. These alliances will not help Germany conquer new land, but what they will do is protect Germany from encirclement by enemies, right? So you sort of shore up borders of the German nation, and you guarantee that those are going to be safe. There's also a brief alliance with Russia to protect the eastern border, but that deteriorates by the 1890s. All in all, Bismarck's playing a very long, very cautious, very sort of pragmatic game with the goal of preventing war and really building German momentum slowly. Not everybody agrees with this. There are other powerful institutions in Germany that resist Bismarck's cautious approach. The military, for one, wants a more aggressive foreign policy. They want to fight, right? They're very bellicose. They're very aggressive. And the new Kaiser, Wilhelm II, he's the grandson of Kaiser Wilhelm I, who had sort of ushered Bismarck into power, and Bismarck had really been his right-hand man. Wilhelm II, he is a militaristic man himself. He dreams of glory on the battlefield. He wants to conquer new land. He wants Germany to be the premier power of Europe and for everybody to know it. And so in 1890, he effectively fires Bismarck, sends him into retirement. And the leaders who replace Bismarck, they don't have that same determination to avoid war. So what we're seeing from the 1890s forward is an increasingly aggressive, nationalistic Germany that wants to expand its power. Okay. All of this is happening. France begins making similar moves. In the 1890s, France begins courting the Russians. By 1894, they have forged a new military alliance as well, which means that Germany now has allied enemies on both sides, to the west and to the east. Britain is watching all of this very warily, right? Britain recognizes that the German army is now the most formidable in Europe, but the British still have that most formidable navy, but they're very concerned. If the Germans create a formidable navy, then they could easily blockade Britain, starve them out in case of war. They could also challenge British imperial domination around the world. And so the British are growing concerned, and they also ally with France. This is in 1904. They sign what was called the Entente Cordiale, or the Cordial Understanding. This is kind of a shocking move. Most of this class, we've been talking about Britain and France being at war with one another. These were ancient rivals, right? Catholic France and Protestant Britain aligning really suggests to us just how powerful the threat of Germany seemed, at least seemed. And then this alliance expands in 1907 to include Russia as well, and they call this the Triple Entente, right? The triple interest. So, in the long history of European conflicts, the Triple Entente would have probably seemed almost unthinkable, right? Think back to the post-revolutionary period in France, the age of Napoleon, and imagine Russia and Britain, these two arch enemies of Napoleonic France, one day siding. It's really quite breathtaking, but it reminds us that German power has really forced a complete revolution in how European nations imagine their relations with one another. So by 1907, the continent is split into these two large alliances, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, Britain, and the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. So this is what we call the entangling alliances. This is one of the key causes of the First World War, is that each of these nations is sort of defensively building relationships with others, and part of those relationships is a guarantee of mutual defense, which means that if any one of these nations, or any two of these nations, begins to get pulled into conflict with one another, the others will as well, right? There's going to be this gravitational pull into a mass conflict. So any regional conflict could actually be quite dangerous on a sort of vast scale. Between 1907 and 1914, the Germans are moving ever closer to Austria-Hungary as well. They realize Italy is probably not a very significant and powerful ally, and this idea of Britain, Russia, and France together is incredibly threatening to Germany. So once the Triple Entente is sort of agreed to in 1907, tensions are going to be very high, and the risk of something very significant happening is just increasing all the time. What the Germans may have realized, may not have realized, but they did, they went for this anyway, is that Austria-Hungary is a very dangerous ally. I've mentioned this a few points. I talked about this in our discussion of Metternich. I talked about this in our discussion of 1848. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was incredibly diverse, ethnically diverse, religiously diverse, politically diverse, and it's vast, and it stretches from Central Europe way out to Eastern Europe and to Southeastern Europe. It touches modern nations of Poland and Ukraine, and parts of Italy, obviously Austria and Hungary, and then down into this region called the Balkans. And in all of these places, there are ethnic groups who are demanding some degree of autonomy, national sovereignty even, right? That idea of nationalism is very powerful in this part of the world. Let's talk about the Balkans for a second. Here's a sort of zoomed out map so you can see the region, the sort of broader region referred to as the Balkans. This is Italy here to give you a sense of context of where we are on the map. This is Ukraine up here and Turkey here. So that kind of gives you a sense of where it is. It's the Mediterranean Sea, of course. And here is a sort of zoomed in map so you can get a sense of what these nations are today. This region has gone through a number of different iterations in the 20th century. For much of the 20th century, a large swath of the Balkans is referred to as Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia broke apart in 1992. But all of these nations are home to different ethnic groups that are on the ground in the early 20th century, and they're struggling for political autonomy from the Ottoman Empire, which is based in Turkey, over here to the east, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire based in Vienna in Austria up to the north here, okay? The Ottomans are losing their grip on the region throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. And as the Ottomans pull out, Austria-Hungary is really trying to assert more and more power over the region. And in 1908, they annexed this region here, Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is a controversial move. Serbia, over here, right, just to the east, claims that this territory is actually Serbian, that there are many Serbs who live in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and so they should be incorporated into a greater Serbian nation. And so now we have Serbia, we have Austria-Hungary lining up against one another. They're contesting this territory. Russia is an old sort of Slavic ally of the Serbs. They say, yeah, they're right. There should be a greater Serbian nation. They do have control over this territory. And so now we have Russia and we have Austria-Hungary lining up against one another, which means the two major alliances of Europe are in a potential conflict with one another. Okay. Right, the French and British have sworn to back Russia, who has sworn to back Serbia, and the Germans have sworn to back Austria-Hungary. Between 1908 and 1913, there's this cauldron of entangling alliances, nationalistic determination, militaristic pride. All of this is bubbling up in the Balkans, and by the end of 1913, the ingredients are in place for a truly continental conflict. With Austria and Serbia, and therefore Russia, on a collision course. The fuse is prepared, and it is lit on June 28th, 1914, which is a Serbian national holiday, June 28th, that is, when a Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, along with 7 collaborators, assassinated the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand in the Bosnian city Sarajevo. Right here, you see it's the capital. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, he is the sort of heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. So he's an incredibly important figurehead in the empire's politics. And within a month, in response to his assassination, Austria declares war on Serbia. And this is Princip, the assassin himself. This photo was taken, I believe, within a week of the assassination, a week after. So, in response to Austria declaring war on Serbia, Russia mobilizes its forces. And just hang on to your hats for a second here as I kind of run through all the stuff that happens. And I don't want you to memorize sort of the chain of events in the summer of 1914, but to just get a kind of sense of how we get from the assassination to the outbreak of a continental war. So here we go. Russia mobilizes its forces. In response to that, Germany declares war on Russia. 2 days later, Germany declares war on France. By August 4th, the German army marches through neutral Belgium to invade France, and in response to marching through a neutral country, in this violation of Belgian neutrality, Britain declares war on Germany on the same day, August 4th. So dominoes just fall, particularly in late July and into early August. And so the First World War begins in August of 1914. Historians, really beginning in August 1914 and ever since, have argued over which nation deserved the blame. Was it German aggression? Was it something natural in the German people? They were naturally aggressive, and that's what caused the war. Was it Austro-Hungarian lust for land? Was it Serbian radicalism? What was the thing? Ultimately, it's probably best to just say, look, there was a political powder keg that had been building since the 1870s that went back to real sort of 19th century issues of nationalism and had shaped politics from the Balkans to Britain, right? There is a culture that is fascinated with the idea of violence. We read Nietzsche last week, right? Nietzsche is working in a context of a civilization that's fascinated by violence. A civilization that's fascinated by power and is increasingly embracing the irrational. So the entangling alliances all but assure that this powder keg is going to be lit, that it's going to explode, right? Any small conflict in this context could easily spiral into a massive one, and there's no real breaks in the system after a while. The First World War is one of the pivotal events in modern world history, and we could really discuss it at great length for the entire semester. In lieu of that, what I'll do for the rest of the lecture is just kind of give you a quick rundown of the experience of the war, sort of focus on two important questions. And then at the end, I'll just quickly pivot to thinking about some of the consequences, which we'll deal with in much greater detail after spring break. So the first topic I want to discuss for the rest of the lecture is the wave of popular support that greeted the war. You read about this week. And then I want to shift to a discussion of the course of the war, particularly the experiences of combatants on the Western Front. I think that the experience of fighting in the First World War has dramatically shaped warfare ever since. So we'll talk about why that is. And then we'll end with a quick question about how did World War I alter the political, the social, and the economic path of modern European history. Let's start, though, with the coming of the war. In early August 1914, it sounds almost absurd, but people were delighted. They were ecstatic that war was coming. There's mass patriotic demonstrations all over Europe, from St. Petersburg, where thousands of Russian protesters swarmed the German embassy, to Paris. This is Paris in August 1914. Old soldiers, veterans of the Franco-Prussian War, right? These men are in their 60s. They march down the boulevards singing La Marseillaise and speaking of revenge for the Franco-Prussian War. Right? The war was 44 years earlier, but now is finally the time for revenge. We're going to reclaim Alsace-Lorraine. In Berlin, Germans, they're filling the streets. They're demanding war. Here's what one Berlin newspaper wrote. "It is a joy to be alive. We wished so much for this hour. The sword which has been forced into our hand will not be sheathed until our aims are won and our territory extended." This is Buckingham Palace. Sorry, this is a bit of a pixelated image. In private diaries and personal letters, young European men express the idea that going off to fight is a duty, is a responsibility owed to the nation. University students almost everywhere drop out of school and join their militaries. In the war's first month alone, just in August 1914, 300,000 British men volunteer, and these are some of them. These are British recruits in August 1914. These young men had grown up under the influence of nationalism, but they also imagined that war could offer a cathartic release. It was a chance to shake free from the boredom and the worry and the stress of peace, right? Of everyday life, the concerns of everyday life, and then to be part of something bigger, right? To give your life meaning, to feel a sense of belonging. The German playwright Karl Zuckmayer wrote that the war would bring liberation from the stuffy air, the petrification of our world, right? A feeling that the world had grown petrified. It had grown stale. And this was a chance to really do something worthwhile. It sounds odd, but for many Europeans, the coming of the First World War was the greatest event of their lives, at least at the time, right? This is the best thing that had ever happened. The slogan on many people's tongue throughout the summer of 1914 came from an old Roman poet, Horace. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It's Latin. What it means is, it is sweet and honorable to die for one's country. I think it's an insane moment, right? Looking back, we could say, wow, this is like a contagion of the mind. This love of war sweeps through Europe, this generation of people. But I also think of this as sort of an innocent time. Europeans saw the coming of the war as an adventure. It's going to be over by Christmas. They didn't understand what we, hopefully, today understand. They didn't understand the power of the technology that industrialization had made possible. They didn't understand the sort of inability of their leaders to get out of this, what they've started. They didn't understand that the adventure of war might come with costs that they weren't prepared for. And they certainly didn't understand that the war would not be over by Christmas, as many people claimed it would, but would instead be prolonged, unimaginably deadly, and in the end, sort of fruitless. Okay, all of the things that we know they're about to experience, they don't know, and so they celebrate. The European armies were large in 1914, but they would swell through volunteers and conscription during the next 4 years. This is from Scientific American in September 1914, giving us the relative strength of the different armies. You see the Russian army is about 6 million trained men, the Germans 4 million, French is 3.8 million. But these are going to grow. They're going to grow rapidly over the next 4 years. The British military is going to increase by a factor of 8. Most of the others are going to double in size. So what this means is that there's an entire generation of men who were born in the 1890s, as well as some younger men who lie about their age, who were born after the 1890s, who are going to be sucked into the war. Their lives are going to be completely upended or simply ended, right? What did they experience in the fighting? Let's talk a little bit quickly here about some strategy. The Germans had sort of been planning for this for a long time. Recognizing that you have enemies on your east and west meant there had to be some kind of plan to deal with that quickly and efficiently if the nation was going to survive a war. They know they're going to have to fight on both fronts, the Eastern Front and the Western Front. And so to prevent becoming totally encircled and spread thin, getting stuck fighting on both fronts at the same time, they have this plan. It's called the Schlieffen Plan, to put all their force quickly into the Western Front, right? We're just going to go to France. We're going to punch them in the face. We're going to knock them out. We're going to subdue them. And then we will quickly pivot to the east and we'll deal with the Russians, right? The Russians, they have this massive military, but everyone kind of recognizes it's pretty disorganized. It's kind of bumbling. It's going to take a long time for them to mobilize. The Germans have a sense of themselves as much more efficient, much more swift, and so that they're pretty confident if they can subdue the French, they can get back in time to defend against the Russians. And initially it works. The French rely on outdated tactics and technology, and the Germans entrench themselves and just mow down the French. They move quickly through Belgium, and by September, they are 40 miles from Paris, right? So just in about 6 weeks, they're about 40 miles from Paris, and the French are just getting crushed. They suffer 285,000 wounded and nearly 100,000 dead in just 6 weeks. 100,000 French soldiers are killed. By September, like I said, the Germans are knocking on Paris's door, but the British come in and support, and the French stop the Germans at the Marne River. This is the first battle of the Marne. It's called, there would be another battle there later in the war. And what it really signifies is a turning point. The war would not be over by Christmas. There's going to be this new phase of fighting, trench warfare, and for nearly 400 miles across northern France, from the British Channel all the way down to the Swiss Alps, both sides begin this process of constructing vast trenches, a whole network of trenches. It's like an ant colony, right? As they prepare for a defensive war of attrition. Who can starve the other side out? Who can wear the other side down over time so that you can continue your push forward? Let's talk about the trenches for a second. Life in the trenches was ghastly. And it quickly strips all these young volunteers of all of their big ideals. The trenches were usually about 7 feet deep, about 3 or 4 feet wide. During the spring, trench walls would give way, and soldiers would simply wade through mud and through water. The trenches were hotbeds of disease, right? Look at all these people. They're in such close quarters. They're hotbeds of vermin, bed bugs, lice, thousands and thousands of rats that feast not only on soldiers' rations, but on soldiers' corpses that lay in between the trenches. Trenches were under constant bombardment, right? One of the strategies that both sides develop is to bombard with artillery a trench, hopefully drive the opposing force out of the trench, wear down the defense, and then storm the battlefield and try and seize some new territory, right? This is kind of the process. But what all of that bombardment does is it completely breaks men down. And the armies begin diagnosing a psychological disorder called shell shock, right? Men are literally shocked, traumatized by not only the barrage of explosions, right? The sound and the fury of the explosions, but also by the recognition that at literally any moment of any day, you could die a gruesome death. And so they're just living with that at all times, and it's breaking men down. All of that bombardment really doesn't add up to much, though. There's very few opportunities to actually break the stalemates. And so what we have is years and years of trench warfare, grueling, bloody, absolutely deadly trench warfare. Every once in a while, some hotshot general would say, okay, I've got a new strategy. Here's what we're going to do. And we're going to charge across the land in between the trenches, which everyone referred to as no man's land, because if you stepped into it, you would be shot immediately by machine guns. And yet that rarely worked, right? Every time an army attempts an offensive, attempts to move across no man's land, they're simply butchered. And I'll talk more about that in some detail in just a second here. And one of the reasons for this butchery is that technology really outstripped tactics. Generals really didn't have an idea of where to go once they got into the trenches, but they did have incredibly deadly new technology that they were just beginning to understand, right? This is the first war where tanks and airplanes and modern submarines play a decisive role. And it's also the first war where poison gas plays a significant role in the fighting, right? Poison gas is obviously the most, I would say probably the most notorious legacy of the First World War. The Germans initially developed it in 1915, but all sides do soon after. Its development, ironically, is related to the creation of ammonia, which is a sort of fixed nitrogen. It's an incredibly powerful tool for increasing crop yields in agriculture, which was its initial use. And the German scientist who developed this then recognizes its potential as a weapon of war. So it is both a tool for survival, for curing hunger around the world, and it's a tool of mass death in the war. Victims of gas attacks suffered debilitating effects. Some 90,000 soldiers died from gas attacks, but it's often said that the survivors were the unlucky ones. They would linger in enormous pain and suffering, only to die months later. Despite all of these, here's another good gas attack image. Despite all of these novel technologies, generals, many of whom had earned their glory and their power in the 19th century, they're, like I said, they're relying on outdated tactics. And the real story of most of the fighting on the Western Front is loss of life and little territory gained, right? It's loss of life for no clear reason. In the entire year 1915, the French never gained more than 3 miles, okay? 3 miles of territory in the entire year, and they suffered 1.4 million casualties. 1.4 million casualties to conquer about 3 miles that they held unsteadily. In one single battle, a 10-month battle in the French city of Verdun, German and French casualties topped 1 million men. The Germans began to refer to Verdun as the blood pump of the world because so much blood was spilled there. No battle matched the futility and the stupidity, however, of the Battle of the Somme in the summer and fall of 1916. So these battles overlap with one another. The Somme began with a massive British artillery assault that lasts 8 days. So the strategy here is let's just hammer them with artillery shelling for more than a week. Surely the troops will they'll retreat back from their trenches, will break down the barbed wire barriers that they've created around their trenches, and then we'll easily be able to just sort of storm over the land. After the artillery assault ends, after 8 days, the British climb from their own trenches. This is in early July, and they begin moving across no man's land, only to find the shelling has really done nothing. And the Germans are still there. They're still prepped and ready in their trench, and they're armed with machine guns. 60,000 British soldiers are killed or wounded on the first day of the battle. In the end, British and French forces lose more than 600,000 men. This is just shy of the total fatalities of the entire American Civil War in one battle. This is just one battle. Generals referred to the battle of called this the Battle of the Somme, right? This is the Battle of the Somme. It's just another battle. But soldiers preferred to call it the Great Fuck Up. To make matters worse, in 1917, the British and French lose their ally in Russia. Russia pulls out of the war because they've been suffering massive defeats at German hands. The Russian people are starving, and a group called the Bolsheviks, a communist group, topples the Russian Empire and seizes the state. And we're going to talk about the Bolshevik Revolution in great detail in the weeks ahead. But the Germans themselves are struggling to stay in the war, right? Even though they have their full force on the Western Front, the United States enters the war in 1917 to support France and Britain. This means fresh troops, but it also means a steady supply of new material from this booming US industrial economy. So by 1918, the German people are also losing faith in the war effort. They rise up in anti-war strikes and protests, and then the German Navy mutinies in November of 1918. The Kaiser is forced to abdicate his throne, and he exiles himself to the Netherlands. German socialists and liberals then come together and they declare a German republic, which signs an armistice ending the war in November 11th, 1918. Both sides, as you can imagine, were totally spent by the war. It has left 10 million soldiers dead and another 20 million wounded. This is a generation of men all across Europe who are either lost or broken. And I'll point you to Wilfred Owen's poem, Disabled, which we read for this week, to understand just how much the survivors of the war had lost. Never mind the dead. And yet all of it seemed to be for so little, right? So little has been accomplished. There is no clear resolution here. The loss of a generation for no clear reason is an incredibly damaging psychological outcome for the war. Many Europeans feel disillusioned. They feel betrayed. Western civilization, they begin to think, is not a march of progress and liberty and greater freedom and greater individual autonomy or greater intellectual accomplishment. It is not this path of progress. Instead, it's a wasteland, as the poet T.S. Eliot writes. And for some, as we're going to talk about next week, the disillusionment provides rich inspiration for new directions in art and philosophy. Some of the most important art of the 20th century, novels, painting, poetry, music, is going to emerge from the 1920s. It's going to emerge from this era of disillusionment. But for others, the disillusionment is rich soil for a new politics, extremist politics, that will draw from both the rage and the anger that comes from the end of the war, as well as from the embrace of the irrational that we've been talking about. So next time we're going to discuss this politics of disillusionment in the 1920s, but we're also going to discuss the peace that emerges out of the First World War from the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles. That's all we've got for now, and we're going to pick up more of this story after spring break. Okay, looking forward to discussing the war and these primary sources with you this week. Thanks for watching, everybody.